All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Cynthia Shore, the Executive Director of the Walt Whitman Birthplace Association, and the board and I welcome all of you in our audience today and our special speakers, whom I will introduce in a moment. And I would like to share that this is our sixth and final program of our series, The Legacy of Long Island's First Peoples. Today's program is a Long Island Whaleman of Color and the Circassian Shipwreck. I'd like to welcome our speaker, Lance Gumbs. Welcome, Lance. And I'd like to welcome our moderator and manager of the program, Sandi Brewster-walker. Welcome, Sandi. I'd like to give a shout out to Heather, who is managing our Zooms for the association. Thank you, Heather. And thank you all the staff in the office who helps put these programs together. I would like to thank the sponsors of our program today. The funds for today's program come from the statewide Community Regrant Program. It's a regrant program of New York State Council on the Arts, and it's administered by the Huntington Arts Council. In addition to those sponsors, I'd like to thank New York State Office of Parks and Recreation, Suffolk County, and the Claire Friedlander Family Foundation for all their support, past and present. I do want to announce that this program is being videotaped, so just be aware of that, everyone in our audience, please. And now I would like to get to our interesting and fun part of our program. I would like to introduce our speaker, Lance Gumbs. He is the tribal ambassador of the Shinnecock, and he will discuss the invisible men of the Shinnecock Nation and their relationship with the doomed ship, the Circassian, which ran aground off of Bridgehampton in the winter of 1876. Lance is a co-chair of the annual Shinnecock Indian Powwow and vice president of the National Congress of American Indians for the Northeast region, as well as a former chairman and senior trustee of the Shinnecock Nation. The program today is about the 10 Shinnecock seamen who were among those enlisted to offload the ship's cargo. With a vicious winter storm bearing down on the ship, the crew was forced to stay aboard and lost their lives, striking a terrible blow to the tight-knit Native American community here on Long Island. So I welcome you, Lance. Thank you for being with us. And I will also read an introduction for Sandi, and then I will turn the program over to Sandi. Sandi Brewster-walker is an independent historian, genealogist, freelance writer, and business owner. She is chairperson for the Board of Trustees and acting executive director for the Indigenous People Museum and Research Institute. She has served in President William J. Clinton's administration as deputy director of the Office of Communication at USDA. Brewster-walker is a member of the Montaukett Indian Nation, an executive director and government affairs officer. In the Long Island region, she is a member of the board of directors for the Long Island Museum and the Friends of Plum Island, as well as being on the advisory board of the Cold Spring Harbor Whaling Museum and the Friends of Connecticut River State Park. In 2017, Sandi was a winner of the Press Club of Long Island Media Award for third place for her narrative column. Sandi is the author of the book, Gone Whaling, Long Island Seamen of Color, to be published by History Press, and she is working with the environmental educators at Connecticut State Park Preserve on a Gone Whaling traveling exhibition grant. It gives me great pleasure to welcome both of you today. And Sandi, I will now turn the program over to you. If there's anything I've missed, please fill it in or let me know. And I'm very excited to have both of you here today. This has been a long series, long in the making, and very exciting in the offering. And Sandi has done a wonderful job, both in envisioning the programs and arranging the speakers and moderating. So I want to say especially a warm thank you to Sandi. It's a pleasure to have been working with you, and I look forward to our continued program collaborations. Sandi.
And thank you. Thank you very much. I just wanted to mention the agenda. the agenda, I'm going to talk very briefly about why I chose Lance to speak, as well as introduce him for his presentation. Then we'll do a Q&A, a closing remarks, and a thank you. Now, why I selected Lance is because he's a good friend, and he's both Montaukett, like all the other speakers that we've had, and he's both Montaukett and Shinnecock. And you notice I put the Montaukett first. And he also is a direct descendant of Ferdinand Lee, who was one of the men that were one of the whalemen, I should say, and probably a relative of a number of other whalemen. But that's kind of why I chose Lance. And also, as you'll see, his mother this morning, he was telling me, his grandmother it was, told him a lot of good stories about her ancestors. And he's going to share some of them with us today. I wanted to also show you this. This is the cover, the photo that's going to be used on my book that's coming out sometime next year. And I'm very proud of it. A gentleman over in Brussels did it for me. It's a painting, an oil painting. Throughout Long Island, from about 1790 to 1876, around the time of the Circassian Shipwreck, whalemen were constantly going to sea. They started out going just up around to the north, and like that, they'd go up maybe for 6 months or a year or so. Then they started following the whales south to the breeding grounds, and they'd stay maybe 2 years and then come back. When I should have mentioned, when the whales went north, they were going up to the feeding grounds. And then they started later following the whales in the early 1800s down around either Africa or South America and up to the Sandwich Islands and then up to Alaska. Some of the ships actually stayed out for 5 years. Now, in my book, I talk about at least 400 whalemen of color from Long Island. They were anywhere from the head of the fish, which Long Island looks like a fish, so that's around Brooklyn and Queens, to Orient Point and Montauk. They stretched all over the island. And how I got a lot of the information about these whalemen, I go into the different archives and I pull up seaman protection certificates. And then I start researching them from there. And these are some of the custom house records I've been to and I'm still going through a lot of them. But most people think the whalemen only came from the very tip of Long Island in Cold Spring Harbor, and that's not true. And this is just some of the vessels in the 1800s and some of the seamen. And I'm sure most of you have seen these pictures and not realized that they were seamen. I found one in my research, and he was Indian, and he actually came out of Islip. There were actually, I ended up with about 3 or 4 out of Islip. And then we had a Fowler out of East Hampton, and that was a big Montaukett family, both in East Hampton and in the western part of Suffolk. And I'm going to let Lance tell you the rest of the story. Lance?
Thank you, Sandi, and
You're
thank you,
welcome.
Cynthia, for having me on.
Oh, sorry about that.
History is very interesting. The word itself says his story, and that's one of the things that has always interested me, because history has always been told by others, And I've had the wonderful opportunity to get a lot of our history, which, as you know, Sandi, we are an oral tradition people. We hand down our stories and our language and our stories and all of our history through our oral traditions. And so it's sometimes quite interesting to read his story versus our story and what our people have said about the history going back to first contact. And it differs dramatically in some areas. And in following up and reading stories about the Circassian and how it was perceived is dramatically different from how our people have told the story, how our people here at Shinnecock have discussed it, and the thought process that went through our people's minds versus what was written in a lot of the newspapers at the time. And I've looked at so many of them, and they all have this connotation that all of our people were lost. And that was quite interesting. You know, some of the articles talked about our people, you know, as the last 10 men of the Shinnecock Nation or the Shinnecock tribe at the time. And it's really interesting to note that that was the farthest thing from the truth. Yes, there was a certain amount of tribal members that lived here in our community, but we also had a tremendous amount of people who had gone off res and were living in the city, who were very much a part of our community. We had 3 big clusters of Shinnecock people that lived in the Bronx, in Queens, and over in Brooklyn, very similar to the Mohawks, who were the iron workers, and they had a big community over in Brooklyn as well. So, you know, that caught me in the very beginning when I started reading this, and I said, last of the Shinnecock men. And we're like, no, that's not true. And so again, you know, history is always his story. It's not our story. But from my grandmother and others who had their relatives, you know, including her grandfather and her great-grandfather, the stories of the Circassian came out a little bit different than what was written. Obviously, our men in Shinnecock here, we were all sea people. We were all people of the water. And as the connotation says, we're people of the stony shore. And so our living literally and our subsistence was off of the water. So we knew the waterways very, very well. We knew the tides, we knew the currents, because we were used to going out in these little canoes and little dugouts. So there was a big difference in going out in a big ship and going out and understanding the currents from a little canoe, which, you know, is part of our whaling as well. I'll get to that in a minute. But there was a big difference in going out in the ocean and the backwaters and knowing the tides and the tidal currents. And that's something that was discussed quite frequently here in our community, you know, knowing the waters, knowing the tides, knowing how the currents would shift depending on a storm or depending on the summer, because the summer currents are different from the winter currents. So there was a lot more involved in understanding the waterways than most people, you know, knew or was ever written about. But those were things that were discussed here in the community by, you know, our tribal people at that time. And it centered around being safe out in the water. I mean, even back then, there was boater safety. You hear about it now in modern day times, but even back then there was boater safety. That was part of the traditional way of going out into the water. We highly respected the water. We knew that, it was a gift to us in terms of being able to feed us and sustain our way of life. And so we never took it for granted at any point in time. And so when the Circassian, when the accident happened with the Circassian, and the boat ran aground, literally one of the first places they came was to our community here, to the Shinnecock Nation, the Shinnecock tribe at the time, to find the men that knew those waterways over there in the Mecox area very well. And what they did was they recruited 10 Shinnecock men, one of which, Robert Lee, was a relative of mine. Well, they were all relatives, but he was a relative of mine, as I am from the Lee clan itself, originally. And these men went out, but they were very, very leery about going out there, based on the weather, and and at that time there was no radar or any of the modern day components that are used to determine the weather, but they could tell the weather. They could tell the feel of the water by how cold it was, the direction that the currents were going. And they were all very, very leery about going out to rescue the cargo off of the Circassian. However, there was also a need for funds. And so the call of the money overtook them, and they were convinced that it would be a short salvage mission and they would be in before any major storm would hit or anything that would, remotely have them not want to go out. So they reluctantly agreed to go out to do this rescue mission. And they had rescued about I guess 400. They say it was about 400 pounds of cargo off of the boat, and had gotten it to shore. And on the last mission, a lot of them did not want to go. And it's not written anywhere that they were offered this extra pay to go out. You don't see it anywhere. And I've looked, but they were offered extra pay to go out on this last mission. And they told some of the women in the community, their wives, those who had wives, that they were very, very nervous about going out because of the way that the water was shifting, the way that the wind was shifting, and they felt like it was going to be dangerous. But because of the times and because of the hardship, some of the women convinced them that they needed to go. And so they went out on this last mission very, very reluctantly. And to the point where, it's been said in our community that they were afraid. And that's really unusual for our men to have been afraid on the water. But obviously they didn't go out on the water when they knew that there might be an impending storm, or that there would be a different type of surge that would, dramatically change the direction of the boat that they were going to. So there was a lot that was involved in that. But nonetheless, the women who were the real voices in our community, as we were a matriarchal society here at Shinnecock, convinced them that, they needed this money for the winter. It was in the middle of the winter here in December, and they were convinced And so they went out with a fear factor in them. And when they got out there, just as they had predicted, just as they had felt, their worst nightmares came to fruition. They realized that the storm surge that was coming in was going to be worse than any of the storms that they had. And the captain of the ship at that time refused. They wanted to go to shore. And some of the women went down to the shore because they saw that the impending storm was coming in. And it's as it's been written, which we'll never know the truth because no one survived that. But as it was written, the captain refused to let them go ashore. And they were begging to go ashore. And we know that they were begging to go ashore because the women could hear this song that they were singing. And they actually had sung 2 songs. But the song that they were singing was a song of prayer in our language, in our Algonquin language. And that song of prayer told or let the woman know that these men were afraid. They didn't know why, but they knew that these men were afraid because that was a song that would be sung in times of trouble or in times of stress or fear. So the women knew that something was wrong because they could hear this song on shore because the boat wasn't that far out. And obviously what had transpired next was the captain kept the men on there. The boat started to crack up in the storm. And as the boat was going down, there were some women that were on the shore. And there were other bystanders who have said that they heard this song, this other song being sung. And that other song that they were singing was the death song. It was a song of prayer, asking who we call the Great Spirit or our Creator to take them mercilessly. And the boat went down, and these men were singing as the boat went down. It is probably one of the saddest times in our Shinnecock history, and the greatest loss of life that we had suffered since first contact. We suffered a great amount of loss during first contact. We suffered a great amount of loss with some of the diseases that came in with the Europeans, and our immune systems were not strong enough to overcome. But this was the greatest loss of life in a non-confrontational situation or a non-medical situation. And it affected our community greatly. Again, though, and I want to really clarify, it was not the end of our community. It was not the end of our Shinnecock men. It took 10 of our men, but by no stretch of the imagination was it the end of our community or the end of our tribal full-blooded men, because that's just not true. And it disturbed me when I read some of those discussions, but the storm itself was probably one of the worst storms that they have had in quite some time. And obviously the destructive power of it crunched that ship up, which was an iron-hulled ship at the time. and it crunched that ship up, and it sent it, to its watery grave. When they started to pick up the men that were our tribal men that were floating to shore after the tragedy, only 6 were found at the beginning, and the ceremony that we had in our current burial grounds here on Shinnecock today, there's a section that was carved out for these men. There is a actual memorial there with the names of all 10 men that are that were killed in the accident. David Bunn, James Bunn, Russell Bunn, William Cuffey, George Cuffey, Warren Cuffey, Oliver Kellis, Robert Lee, who was my relative, John Walker, and Lewis Walker, all perished in that sinking. And when they were brought home, it's even though I wasn't there, it's still very difficult to talk about it from all of the stories that have been passed down, and how and what it meant to our community. One, just to recover all of the men, and to have all of them buried here in our community was a relief to, especially our matriarchs, our women leaders, and during that ceremony, very similar to the ceremonies that we have today. You had two reverends or two pastors that presided over the ceremony, and the songs were sung. Traditional Christian songs were sung, as we're a Presbyterian people, but also the songs of our language, our going home songs, our traveling mercy songs. Those songs were sung back then almost in the same way that we sing these songs today. I'm also a member of our Young Blood drum group, and we have the honor and privilege to sing at the going home ceremonies of our people, in our way, in our traditional way. And so those songs were sung for the first 6 men, and then later on, the other 4 men were found, and they were brought back to the community. And so they were all laid to rest in an area which is still a memorial here in our community to this day. At the entrance to our burial ground, there is a plaque that was actually put up by New York State that talks about the Circassian and what transpired and the tragedy that it was for our people. That's made out of metal and in the traditional colors of New York State, blue and gold, blue and yellow, which I find very interesting. But they even acknowledged, the tragedy to our community here, and how the long-term effects that it had on our community, and our men not wanting to go out on the water for some time after that, which was kind of damaging to our community as well, because it was our way of life and our substance fishing. But there was just this lack of desire to go out on the water any longer after that. So a lot of our substance way of life started to just take hold really close to shore with our clamming, our eeling, and whatever could be retrieved from the waters close to shore for quite some time after this tragedy. And these are the kind of things that have not been written about. They have not been discussed. But it is our story, and it is the story of my ancestors and those who have passed it down, and the effects that it had on the community in more ways than just losing, the men themselves, how it affected the men that were left here and how they felt about going out on the water after that. So it was devastating on multiple levels from that standpoint. And truthfully, the effects of it are still felt in some ways to this day here in our community. You still have Cuffies that are alive. You still have Lees. I'm a member, as I said, of the Lee family. You still have Kellis's, the families. And, we have a Circassian Day in remembrance of the men that went down every year. We still bring everyone together, the same as the days after the Circassian went down, to honor these men and to recognize the contributions that they made to the community, and what was lost, in our community. And it is something that frustrates a lot of people, because it sort of showed the power that was held over our people, when that ship's captain would not allow these men who knew the waters, who understood what was happening. He refused to listen to them. He refused to allow them to leave the boat. And again, people say, well, how do you know this? Well, we know this through that song that was sung. We know this through that song that was sung prior to the boat actually going down. We knew what that song meant, and that song, was telling that story in its own way. And that's not something that any of the non-Indian people on the shore or any of the people would have understood at that time when they were writing these stories. So they only had their perspective to go on. They did not have our perspective or understand, first of all, our language or our way of life and what that meant. And so you have these two different stories that were told about what transpired at the beach, but then the unknown story, and when the title of this, the forgotten, or the unknown. Well, this is the unknown part that none of the outsiders would have known or heard, or it wouldn't have even been discussed with them. So what you've heard here is stories from my family. And again, Robert Lee was on that boat that went down. He was the brother of my great-great-grandfather, Ferdinand Lee. And he was an integral part of our family, along with all of the five brothers. And so, we've heard these stories from the people in our community, the elders, the ancestors. But for me, almost a direct link with my grandmother, who was born in 1889. I had almost a direct link because her mother was alive at that time. Her grandmother was alive at that time. So I almost have a direct link to the stories that were told the oral history that was told to our people here in our community.
Lance, if I can interrupt you for a quick second, since you
Sure,
talked
Sandi.
about your grandmother's family, I just wanted to go back to those pages about the Lee family. Could you talk a little bit about the Lee family? Because people should know how important they were to the whaling industry.
Well, we were one of the larger families here in our community, and there was you're going back to it.
Yeah, I'm going back to it.
We were one of the larger families, the Lee family, and there was 5 brothers. And the 5 brothers were all whalers, every single one of them. Some made it to higher ranks than others, but they were all, first, second, third, or fourth mates on some of the whaling ships that went out of New London, out of New Bedford, out of Sag Harbor here. They were, it was, obviously that was the industry at the time. And that was a good way to make a substantial living for your family. And a lot of our family started whaling before the industry really took off like it was during that time period where you had the ships going out. Our people went out on canoes in dugouts, and they would go out and beat the water to beach the whales. There was a wonderful art exhibit in our museum that sort of depicted the whole scenario of how it happened and how they would go out in these small little dugouts. And, I noticed in a couple of the readings that they talked about, well, they were calf whales, they were small whales. And again, that's not true. There were a number of very large whales that were brought to shore, that were beached by these men in these little dugouts and these little canoes. And the oldest of the Lees, Garrison, he was part of the ones that used to go out in the canoes before he was actually old enough to get on the ship. He used to go out into the canoes to bring in these whales. So they had a knowledge of that before they even started going out on the whaling vessels. And it's something that our people did, not just here at Shinnecock, though, all along the shore, the tribes that were coastal tribes, the Montauks, Shinnecocks, Unkachugs, all the way up into, the New England area with the Aquinnah Wampanoags up on Martha's Vineyard, and the Mashpee Wampanoags out on Cape Cod. We were all whalers in our own right, but it started before before there was this major whaling industry. There's actually some records that talk about the whales and the whale oil that our people used to get when they were going out in the canoes, and it used to light the lanterns here in the village of Southampton. So this started quite a while before the actual industry took off, and you had the ships and the big ships. Imagine going out in a little canoe, 2 or 3 men in a little tiny canoe, and not like the canoes of today, but these were made out of the trees, out of either birch or some of the hardwoods. Imagine going out there and you're running up on a whale that's 35, 45 feet long, and bringing them to shore. But they used to go out in these parties, they used to form that triangle, and they used to drive these whales to shore. And so they knew this, and that's part of the way that they learned about the currents out there as well, and how to drive them to shore so that the currents would take them and help them bring them right to shore. So there was a lot of factors that was involved in this, and listening to, again, stories that my grandmother would tell, that her grandfather and her great grandfather, but she got the stories from her grandfather about her great grandfather, which was Ferdinand Lee, which he was one of the first, if not only, and I haven't seen anyone anywhere else, whaling captain. There was one gentleman that was a captain temporarily because his captain got sick on one of the whaling boats. But my great grandfather, Ferdinand Lee, was made it all the way to the ranks of whaling captain. And that, was a tremendous feat in itself. And on July 15th in 1871, he took his ship out, and I always pronounce it wrong. It's the Kalia.
Could you also tell everyone about Notley? I like Notley.
Well, he was an interesting great uncle. He was whaling, and he decided that he didn't like it. And when the ship that he was on, he was on the Abraham Barker, and when he was on the ship, he reached the island of Tonga, and he decided to stay. And from Ferdinand's account of it, because nobody knows really, they really didn't see him after that. They heard the stories, but from Ferdinand's account to my grandmother, he married into, I guess, what would be considered the royal family of Tonga over there at that time, and decided to never come back. And, it's quite interesting because recently we had his relative from Tonga reach out to the tribe. I have not met her yet. I'm very interested in meeting her, but she knew about Shinnecock from him. She had lived over there, and she knew about Shinnecock from him, and she knows where the family is at. She knows the circumstances that surrounded his marriage into the royal family over there. So it's interesting. This is going to be my next project, is to track her down and to talk with her about the stories of what she knows about Notley. But he decided that maybe whaling wasn't for him, and hooked up with a member of the family over there, the royal family, and that's where he stayed, and only talked to the family through hearsay. Is this hearsay again? But they said that he had reached out, but he wasn't never going to come back, and he didn't. And he was.
Could I add something there?
Yes, ma'am.
I've spoken to Lance's. This is Sandi. I spoke to Lance's relative from Tonga, and she got as far as New York and couldn't figure out how to get out to Shinnecock. But they had property and stuff that the chief of the tribe had given him. She has a big family. They're still in Tonga, California, and Australia.
Yeah, that's part of what was going on at that time too, because we have a lot of Shinnecock people who were on whaling boats that are still to this day in different, the families are still to this day in different parts of the world, especially in Australia, and obviously in Tonga, where they would get on these whaling boats, and they would go, and they just would end up staying. They didn't come back. And so it's been quite interesting, tracking down some of the families, especially some of the Cuffies and the Buns that are scattered around the world, but have their connections right here, to Shinnecock, the historical connections right here to Shinnecock and to our people. And, when you look at how, during that time period, how long these trips took, you're talking 4 years, 5 years, they were out on these small vessels, because they were nowhere near the size of the vessels that we have today, the shipping vessels and, the cruise ships. They were nowhere near that size. So you had a lot of unrest at the time, and you had a lot of desertions. And that's one of the things that happened on my grandfather's boat, my great-great-great-grandfather's boat. He had a number of desertions that happened in a couple of the ports. He actually had to get rid of his first mate in a port. He then brought on another first mate, and ironically, that first mate and his own brother, who he actually found on another island, Notley, actually ended up staying on Tonga.
Put it on mute. So
I think somebody's talking.
Yeah, somebody should mute there.
Now try.
Yeah, you got to mute. Thank you. You there, Lance?
Yeah, I'm here. So, it was quite interesting listening to, the stories that my grandmother would talk about in terms of the five brothers and their exploits, and how they basically sailed the world, at a time where racism did exist. The minority individuals in this country were not well received, and yet these men managed to travel the world, and part of that, in the stories, was because of the harshness of it. It was not easy work. It was harsh work, and especially some of when they would boil the oil down for, the blubber, the whale blubber down for the oil. And they would talk about the stench of it and how it would be in their noses. They would smell it for long, long periods of time. And she talked about that. She said, one of the things that was the most displeasing to those men was when they had to boil. It wasn't the hunt. They enjoyed the hunt. That was the challenge, being out on there, and that they enjoyed the hunt. And, Garrison was one that he had this uncanny knack of being able to spot whales out there, way off in the distance. And the hunt was the exciting part to them, but the miserable part to them, and the part that they despised the most, was when they had to boil the whale blubber down to get the oils. And they talked about the stench of it, and how even after coming back to shore and being on land for an extended period of time, they could still smell it. It was just, that's how strong it was. And they were a feisty bunch, to say the least. But they were part of the greater whaling community that, as I said earlier, stretched from up in New England all the way along here. But the Indian community, especially, that really the history of it has not been told from, again, our story, from our way of hearing what had transpired, and the harshness of the trips, the cold that they sometimes faced. And as Sandi said earlier, they followed the whales down south, so they were able to a lot of times go into the warmer climates, so they really didn't face the cold weather. But the times when the whales started going north, and they had to go north to get the whales, which is what happened to my grandfather. Well, I keep saying grandfather, great-great-great-grandfather, Ferdinand Lee. He was so frustrated with his voyage as a shipping captain that he only did one voyage as a captain. And again, as I said, he had a lot of desertions. He was able to finally bring the ship back in, and they literally lost the company money. The company was not able to sustain the amount of the cargo that they brought back in. Was nothing compared to what he had been bringing back in when he was a first mate, when he was a second mate. And that was one of the reasons why they gave him the ship's the captain of this the Callio was because he had done so well in his previous voyages, and he had been written up by his captains and the superiors numerous times, talking about his exploits and how well he had done. And so it was unusual to, first of all, to get those kind of write-ups, but because of those write-ups and because of the language that the former captains had used, they felt comfortable enough to give him his own boat. The records that were kept on his boat were not too good in terms of past records that had been kept on other boats. So we don't know the whole story of what happened, but we do know that there was major desertions. We do know that he had difficulty with his first mate. And so when they came back in, he was literally frustrated. And he said that, that was it for him. He did not want to go back out again. On any boat for that matter, not just as a ship's captain, but on any boat. And so he ended up going back out it's 8 or 9 years later. He ended up going out on another boat, and that boat went up to the Arctic, and that boat was lost. They sent out search parties. It was last seen in October by another whaling vessel that was in the area, and that was the last time that the boat was seen or heard from. However, there are these family stories passed down that our great-great-great-grandfather Ferdinand Lee was seen up in Alaska with an Eskimo woman. How true that is, we don't know. But that was one of the rumors that came down from some of the other whaling ships, was that they had saw him up there and that he was living up there with an Alaskan Aleut woman. So we don't know if that's true or not. But again, that's the things that legends and myths are made of. So,
but Lance, I also read that story in a San Francisco newspaper, that one of the former crew members or something claimed he spotted him up in Alaska.
Yeah.
But also, I just wanted to add, because I researched him a lot, that they gave him the ship, but then they gave him a crew where there were men on the ship couldn't communicate with each other because they spoke different languages.
Yes.
Then he had some of the white crewmen on the ship that actually resented the fact that they had to report to a captain that was Indian. So
Yes.
there was a lot of stuff going on.
Yeah, well, you know what it was too is, you know, there was a lot of Portuguese people, there was a lot of Cape Verdean people, and so we had some of those crew members on the boat as well, and some of the last names because you know, up with the Mashpee Wampanoag people up on Cape Cod, there are still to this day a tremendous amount of Cape Verdeans that have intermarried with the Mashpee Wampanoag people. So there was, you know, he had Cape Verdeans on the boat. He had some Portuguese. And so there was obviously that language barrier as well. And then there was, obviously, as you alluded to, there were, you know, white shipmates on there that didn't take kindly to, and he literally said that. You know, that was one of the stories that came down. He said, you know, that he had a tremendous amount of trouble with the white shipmates who did not want to take orders from you know an Indian, you know, a person of color, but much less an Indian who, you know, still at that time was, you know, perceived to be I won't say savage, but uncultured. So that was you know, in talking and the things that my grandmother had said, that was a big factor in his desire not to go back out in that capacity, or for that matter, in any capacity. You know, the whaling industry again was a very, very tough industry. It was, but then to add to that, you know, a measure of racism. And you know, outright luckily there was no mutiny. You know, he said that no one tried, you know, any of that. There was no mutiny aboard, but there was, you know, the desertions. And literally when he was stranded on the island, and he had to literally recruit almost a whole new crew, and that's actually where he found his brother at there, and he had to literally recruit almost half of a crew in order to continue the mission
and get it back home.
And there was so much frustration with that he just said, I'm not going to do this again. And he came home, and then you know, there's only so long that, you know, people who are real sea people, who are water people, can stay off the water. And, you know, the call of it came back, and then the, you know, also the need for funding came back. And so he did get on that next boat, and that pretty much was the end. And the five brothers all died on the water in some way, in some form or fashion, except for Notley, who was over there living the lavish life on Tonga with his royal family. But the other brothers all perished on the sea, and that's the Lee family. They had children, and so the children are alive and well. The great-grandchildren, the great-great-grandchildren, I obviously am one of them, are all alive and well. And researching, you know, this legacy here. This picture that you just pulled up is a very interesting picture because it was supposedly taken, and it was taken in 1884. We know that the incident happened in 1876, and this picture was taken in 1884. And somehow or other, they equate this picture with the loss of the men from the Circassian. And it's always baffled me as to how they conclude that. I mean, if you see in the background, you see a number of Indian or tribal men in the background, but it says the last of the Shinnecock Indians, and it's always baffled me as to how they came to that conclusion. But again, it's his story, it's not our story, and obviously, just from the picture itself, that is not true. But
we were laughing earlier.
It's one of those things.
I was just going to say, you and I were laughing earlier today. If you read the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, they're always saying the last Shinnecock died or the last of the Montauketts died. And then a couple of years later, or even the same year, they'll say another last one died.
Yeah, well, exactly. And I mean, that was how stories was written. So, we've taken those stories and we've read the stories in the newspapers and the articles and, the magazines. But at the end of the day, we have to go by our own oral history, our own oral recollection of these events, and what literally is passed down to us. And you can see from this picture, like, how is this the last of the Shinnecocks? Like, it just makes no sense. But and then that doesn't take into account all of the Shinnecock people that were living in the communities in the city, all of the communities. We had a community up in Bellport. We had some living up in Amityville. So we've had, our people were spread out, far and wide. And to say that, any one tragedy would diminish the people of the community. I mean, yes, was it hurtful? Did it take a lot of our men? Yes, it did. But it did no way in shape or form did it, bring us down to the last few people of our community. This last picture here that you have here, they did the salvage expedition out on the Circassian, and they brought up the anchor here, and it's over in Hampton Bays at the
life-saving station, I think it is.
Yeah, the Coast Guard station over there. But this is a remembrance, and again, for us, it was a extremely hurtful time. But the Shinnecock people are resilient, and we managed to survive. And if you look behind me here, in our tribal seal, I don't know if you can see it, but in our tribal seal, we have the whales, because we were whalers. Our tribal seal depicts our whole history of our wiki-ups, but it shows the little canoe in the middle here. It's kind of hard to see, but it shows the little canoe in the middle of our men going out, and the whales on the side, depicting the fact that that's what we were. We were our history, our legacy is that we were whalers and people of the Stony Shore.
Oh, thank you, Lance. I wish we had time so you could tell some more of your grandmother's stories. Maybe you can kind of get them in as you answer some questions from people. Are there any questions? If you have any questions, just either raise your hand or unmute. We're a friendly group. We won't yell and scream. Any questions?
Hi, Lance. Ron Lawburn here. Hi, Sandi.
Hi.
Hey, thanks very much, Lance. Really great presentation. What I'd like to know is, were there any among the, let's say, the Shinnecock whalers or any of the Northeast, any people from the South eastern Atlantic shore, say from the eastern shore of Virginia or the Carolinas, because I know that the center of the whaling industry was up in the Northeast.
Yeah.
From my understanding, and just some of the discussions, and I've been researching this and reading about this for quite some time. There were people who came up to from down there to New York, and attempted to go out. They didn't have the skill set or the background that most of the people up here had, be it native or non-native. They didn't have the skill set because they had not been involved in it. So if they would go out, it was usually maybe one trip out, and that would be it for them. And again, when you look at how long some of these people were doing it prior to going out on the boats, on the ships, the ones that were in the canoes, but even the non-Indian people that were going out, most of them had all grown up on the water in that way, dealing with not only the fishing, but dealing with the whales, because obviously that was the #1 industry at the time. And so they came up literally inside of families that were doing that. I mean, you take my family, the Lee family, you had the 5 brothers. You look at the Bunns, you look at the Cuffies, and not just the Cuffies down here. There were Cuffies up in New England, Cuffies up in Springfield, Massachusetts, over in the New Bedford area. So you had these people that were sort of bred into this industry coming up, and so they understood it a lot better than a lot of the folks that were coming up and getting into the industry from along the Eastern Seaboard. And that it's not to say that they weren't or that they didn't get it, but it wasn't in the numbers or like it was up here in the Northeast.
Yeah, and Ron, if I could add something to that too. If the most of the ships when they left the Northeast would go cross the Atlantic and stay close to the east side of the Atlantic rather than west side because of slavery. Because if they went down the coast, once they got around Maryland, the men of color that were on the ships, most of the times they would have to stay on the ships. They couldn't go ashore because they would run the risk of getting getting put into slavery, not back into slavery, get put into slavery. And some of your southern states actually passed a series of laws, and they would, in a lot of cases, if a whaling ship came into, let's say, Norfolk or into one of the South Carolina ports, the captain would have to leave a bond, or some of the men were even taken off the ship and put in jails until the ship was ready to leave. So that's why they kind of crossed over, and the whales themselves kind of stick away from the U.S. They kind of, when they come down, once they get to Montaukett, they kind of cross over towards Bermuda and then go to past Cape Verde and then cross back over to go to Brazil. They follow, I think it's almost like the Bermuda stream or whatever they call it.
Gulf Stream?
Yeah, Gulf Stream.
Okay. Thanks very much. Thank you both of you.
And I think Barbara had a question. Barbara Grimes.
Yeah, I was just amazed at the credentials of just the Lee brothers that you had up there. And it occurs to me the economic devastation from this disaster must have been huge for the tribe. Can you speak to that?
Absolutely. I just want to make a clear, because I think I misspoke when I said all of the brothers perished at sea, and Garrison, the oldest one, actually did not. Garrison was actually here on the res in well into the 1880s. He did not perish. The other 3 brothers did, and then Notley, who was on Tanga, but I think I said all of them perished, and I just wanted to clarify that point. but the economic impact to the community, because these men were the subsistence fishers of our community, and so they're the ones that brought in, the fish, not only and the whales, because they were all whalers as well. They brought the funds in to the community, but they also sold to the outside community fish and all of the byproducts that would get out of the water, whether it be clams, eels, and so that was, and you had so many different families represented by these men, that it affected, most of the larger families on the Reds, because at that time the Buns were an extremely large family, the Kellises, the Walkers, and obviously my family, the Lee family, they were some of the larger families in the community, and these were the breadwinners. So yes, in terms of the economic impact that it had, because it was a shared, in our community, it was everything was basically shared. It was the shared resources, and if somebody had fish, they would share it with others. If they had a deer, they would share it with others. So the economic impact, to say the least, was greatly impacted, and that is why a lot of the people actually had to end up leaving and going off to the city to find employment, because you had employment out here, and the Hamptons is just like it now, just pretty much like it was back then. You had people that came out here, and they were the wealthy people, but when they left, the economic impact was great. So pretty much like it is today. As soon as Labor Day is over, it's like a ghost town out here, and work becomes hard to find. So yes, to answer your question, there was a great economic impact.
And I'm going to once again add something to that, Barbara. This by the time the Circassian shipwreck took place, whaling was also on a decline. They had discovered oil in Pennsylvania, and then you had a disaster where 20 some odd ships froze in Alaska, even before the disaster that Ferdinand was involved in Alaska. And then you also had a great deal of whalemen of color that, believe it or not, that actually left whaling. And in 1849 to about 1855, they either went to the gold fields, and some of them went to the gold fields in California. And then when gold was discovered in Australia, they took ships over to Australia. There's whalemen from Huntington whose family has gotten in touch with me. They're in Australia, but he started out, and I think Robert Hughes is on this call, from Huntington. But the whaleman started out, actually, he was born in Huntington, but he was following the gold.
I just like to note one other, in 1876. For those of you who don't know, like, American Indian history, in June of 1876 was the Battle of the Bighorn, and that's where the Sioux people had to run in with General Armstrong Custer and wiped out the 7th Cavalry. And so there was already this tumultuous relationship going on right now all across the country with Indian people, because of what had happened with General Custer. That's only a couple of months before. So there's a number of factors, and we don't know if that's one of the reasons why the ship's captain refused to let him get off the boat. But it's all speculation at this point. But that turned the tide after the Battle of the Bighorn with General Custer in 1876. there was a real feverish pursuit of all of the tribes. And, tribes were not, and Indian people were not looked upon very favorably at that time. So, there's other factors that we look at from our standpoint that may have also been involved in, the reasoning for him not allowing, those Shinnecock men to get off the boat. That's just something that, we think about all the time here.
Yeah, you made me think of something else, Lance. You also, after the Civil War and around in the 70s, you still had the ship, the Shenandoah, which was a Confederate ship, even though the war had ended. But for a number of years after, it was attacking whaling ships.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, up in the Pacific. So yeah, there was a lot going on.
Yeah, it's when you look at history, but these things are connected in their own right. Because obviously for Indian people, we were public enemy number one after the Battle of the Bighorn, and it doesn't make a difference that it happened out west. I mean, if you were Indian, you were Indian, and and what had transpired with them wiping out the entire 7th Cavalry. Didn't sit well with folks, all across what we call Indian country. And so, again, it could have been reasoning, it might not have been, but, when we look at it, we look at all the factors that were involved in, not just what transpired here and on Long Island, but what was going on in the country as a whole. And that was a very bad year for Indian people as a whole, all across the country. The lockdowns that were going on, the wars that continued after that, to track down Sitting Bull and his band. And so there was, it's sort of just like, what's going on, even after 9/11, we had that happen and country went into lockdown, because we were attacked. And that was the general feeling back then, is that, the country had been attacked, and the whole 7th Cavalry had been wiped out. And so, Indian people were not looked upon favorably at that time. So, could that have been a factor? We'll never know. But, it's in the back of our minds.
Yeah, because there was enough going on. Cynthia?
Yes, thanks, Sandi, and thank you, Lance. Your narrative is quite moving, and especially at the beginning when you were talking about the crew singing those songs, I actually got the chills just from listening and envisioning that. I have 2 questions, but the first is, are there any recordings anywhere? You mentioned that those songs are still sung today, is that right? And
Yes.
would there be any recordings that we could listen to or find?
Not of those songs. We don't. We record songs, but we don't record those songs. Those are our special songs. Those are our sacred songs. The ones that we sing for, like at the powwow and for dancing and stuff like that. Those songs can be sung. I mean, can be recorded, but we don't record. Those are passed down, and we don't record those. But
Okay.
each drum group that comes along, learns that song. Each generation comes along. My son now, who sings on our drum group with us, knows these songs. And I actually have my little grandbaby who is, I'm actually Lance the second. My son is Lance the third, and my grandbaby is Lance the fourth.
Oh.
And he sits at the drum with us. He's 4 years old now. And he sits there, and so he's learning these songs now as well. So, traditional wise, those songs are not put out there for recording.
Okay, very interesting. Thank you. I would like to, can people come to, a performance of those, or is it just within the Native American community that's done?
If you happen to attend a funeral, those are only sung at funerals.
I see. Okay.
Those are only done at the funerals, and it will give you the chills. And I can tell you, even when I sing these songs, I get the chills. And we all look to the sky when we're singing these songs. We don't even look at the drum. But to this very day, when I sing those songs, and we're at our funeral here at our cemetery, I still get the chills.
Okay. I will hold my second question in case there's other people who would like to ask or comment.
I don't see any.
I had a question.
Okay, go ahead.
Hi, this is Mandy.
Mandy,
How are
hi.
you?
It says Carl, Mandy.
Yeah, well, technical difficulties such as they are. But you mentioned, very nice to see everyone, and thank you so very much for your sharing information with the community, Lance. You mentioned a lot about grandmothers and mothers and tradition and stories. I'm wondering if you could tell or just speak a little bit about those women who survived and the families who survived and how they continued to move forward in life after their substantial others who provided a lot of the economic support were no longer with them in this current world and walking the earth or on the seas providing.
You know, that's a very interesting point. And I picked my grandmother, you know, I had her for quite some time. And I asked her, but my mother used to talk about that more than my grandmother. It seemed to be a very sore spot for her. But my mother used to talk about the strength of the women. And, you know, in our traditions, you know, as I said earlier, we are a matriarchal society. And, you know, even though the men were the leaders and we had that leadership imposed upon us in 1792 by the state of New York, creating that trustee board, nonetheless, you know, the women were still the background leaders. Make no mistake about that. And I learned that lesson quick, fast, in a hurry from my grandmother. But they were strong women. They were resilient women. And, you know, they had help from the other women in the community. The other women, you know, stood up and came to their aid. And, you know, if you read from the other's perspective, there was a tremendous amount of support, you know, from the Southampton community as well. They, you know, took up donations, they did collections, they did food drives, they did clothing drives to help the families, you know, that had suffered the loss. So there was a tremendous outpouring of goodwill from, you know, the Southampton community, as well as, you know, internally, and the support mechanisms of the other women in the community. You know, the men will be men, but you know, the women in the community really really stood up. And not only the women of, you know, because those were the mothers, but the daughters, you know, because, you know, we're generational here. So you have, you know, sometimes you'll have a house with, you know, the mother, the daughter, and the granddaughter living all in the same house. So the generational factor kicked in as well, with the help of the daughters and sometimes the granddaughters, no matter the age, you know, they may have been young, but, you know, everyone chipped in to support and uplift you know, these women that lost their husbands and the community as a whole. And that's one of the beauties of our community, which differs from the outside communities that I've seen. When I lived in an outside community, I didn't know my neighbor on the left side. I didn't know my neighbor on the right side. You know, with here in our community, we know everybody. Everybody knows everybody. Sometimes that's good. Sometimes that's bad. Sometimes you got everybody in your business. But nonetheless, you know, it was that type of unity, as we call it, unity in the community, where everyone, you know, came together and pitched in. And, you know, economically, there was still a lot of men here. That's one of the things that baffles me with what they said, that there's still a lot of men here in the community that, you know, were able to provide for the community. So, you know, again, that was the outside take on history versus what the real history was, you know, internally here in the community. We weren't as bad off as everybody made it out to be. And especially with everybody that from the city, you know, a lot of the men came back from the city, you know, to help out in the community. So it was a community effort at that time. And it's one of the things that, you know, we often talk about trying to bring back. But it was definitely alive and well at that point in time in our history.
Yeah, before Carlene
Hello,
asks
Lance?
her question, she has raised her hand.
Yes.
I just wanted to mention, when you think about it, these women that lost their husbands that were whalemen were very strong because they had to raise their families by themselves for 3 to 5 years.
Well,
And sometimes their husbands would come in only for a month and be right out again.
So, and at that point, I mean, most of the women at that time, because of those long stints at sea, were the breadwinners. So, you know, and again, that's, you know, whether they were cleaning houses here, you know, or, you know, doing maid work or farming and growing vegetables. I mean, you know, they did it all. So, you know, they were kind of used to it. In that sense, if you can ever get used to something like that. But at the end of the day, they continued life, and our community got stronger from it.
Okay, Carlene,
Hello?
Lena, could you ask your question? And
Yes,
then Joy.
I didn't necessarily have a question. I am just,
Oh.
you know, happy to be a part and listening to all this information. But it just happened. I was living in Florida in 2019, and I went over to Mississippi on some personal business concerning my granddaughter. And I met the captain of the ship who was responsible for bringing up the Circassian ship. And he knew that I wasn't from Mississippi. He kept looking at me when I was in the lobby, and he asked me, where was I from? He said, you have to be from the north. I said, yes. He said, did you happen to know anything about the Montaukett and the Shinnecock? I was like, yeah. And he says, well, you remind me of them people, because I was in a debate with someone concerning an issue that we had in the room. And he said you was so professional and so spot on, but you didn't back down. And the women there, you know, kind of had that characteristic. So it just dawned on me that I should ask you where you were from. And I said, absolutely. He said, so you're familiar with the Shinnecocks, and do you know anything about that ship that went underground and all those people that were lost? I was like, absolutely. Some of those people are my relatives. And he was shocked, but he was the biggest white guy I had ever seen. And he was the kindest, and the sensitivity that he had concerning that ship and the lives that were lost, and how proud he was that his crew was chosen to bring that up out of the waters, out of the watery grave, as Lance put it. It was just amazing how interconnected we still are, and noticed by certain people at any given time.
Oh, thank you.
Hello?
Are there any other questions?
Yes.
Yes, I have a
Sandi?
question.
Oh, there's I think there's
Hi.
two. Kim and
Hi,
Linda?
Kim Yates. I just had a quick question. Is it possible that I can get a copy of today's presentation?
Oh, yes, I'll send it out to everyone.
Thank you.
And someone else? I heard
Hello.
someone else.
Sandy?
Yes.
Sandy, can you hear me?
Yeah,
Hi.
who is it?
This is Linda Green Darden.
Okay. Hi, Linda.
Yeah. And Lance, I want to thank you so much to teach me about the ship. My grandfather, Nathaniel Bunn, was a whaler, and my grandmother talked of him often. She was Mary Emma Bunn, 1860 to 1960, and she talked a lot about her relatives, mainly Cuffy. So I guess somewhere along the line, we're probably related. And I learned a lot of history, and Sandy's been trying forever to get me to do these Zoom groups to learn, and I'm so glad I did, because nobody ever truly dies until you stop saying their name. So when I heard the
the Buns, the Lees, and the Cuffeys. That just brought them all back to life to me again. So I want to thank you again.
Thank you. Are there any other questions?
Mm-hmm.
If not, Lance, thank you. And I'm going to turn the program back to Cynthia.
Okay, yes. All right. Thank you very much, Lance. I did have another question, but I'll email it to you privately.
Oh, no. Well, why don't you ask it? Because I'd like to hear it too.
Okay. All right. It's an observation. Once when I was in graduate school, I took a whole course on Moby Dick. And as I was thinking about it, there was a Native American on the board, the Pequod, but it was taken from real life. And I was just wondering if, as Native Americans in your, your own conversation, if that ever comes up, it's such a classic American book. Interestingly enough, I vaguely remember that he was the one, the Native American, his name was Tashigo, I believe. He's spotted the whale, and he was known for his prowess in hunting, which he got from his Native American background. And he was identified as such by Melville. As a character, he was identified as a Native American. But he spotted the whale first, but Ahab, the captain, refused to acknowledge that and swindled him out of his award, that whoever spots the whale first evidently got a doubloon or something. So I thought that was interesting that Melville was commenting on a social aspect of something that was going on in America. And if that's, part of any conversation in the Native American, conversations about that.
It's very interesting. We often have conversations about how we were cheated out of certain things. You said he was Pequot though, and I always thought he was Aquina Wampanoag.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
No, the Pequod was the name of the boat, but yes, he's the Wampanoag. Sorry.
Oh yeah, okay, yeah. I thought he was, I always thought he was because I thought he was Aquina Wampanoag.
Yeah.
But yes, that is the chairwoman of the Aquina Wampanoag is one of my good friends right now, Cheryl Andrews Maltese, and we kind of go back and forth about the quality of our oysters and who's got the better oysters between us here at Shinnecock, Mashpee, up on Cape Cod, and Aquina. But I often kind of just rub it in, about how he was cheated out of that, and she's like, well, that was the times, and when we look at it, we kind of laugh and joke about it. But that happening then is the same thing that's happening now. And I mean, we're all up in arms right now about the wind farm situation that's encroaching upon some of our ancestral areas along the coast here and up into New England. And so all of these and how we have literally been left out of the conversation. And so it's a reflection of just history in general, how from those times right up to now, the same things are still going on. But I like the teaser about that, just to your point though.
Okay, thank you. And so I will then round up our discussion and again say thank you to Sandi and thank you to Lance. It was just so enlightening, and this whole series has been wonderful. Thank you, Sandi, for putting this up.
You're welcome.
We can look back and see all the ground that we've covered, and both Sandi and I have discussed going forward in 2024 with continued programming. I'm looking forward to that and to learning more about the Long Island Native American experience, both past and present. Just wonderful, Lance. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And please, watch our website, all of you in the audience, for other programming that's coming. Give a shout out to Mandy, who conducted our book group. Thank you, Mandy. She did an excellent job of that. And again, presenting new and authentic voices and stories. You talk about history to the Long Island people who are our audience and beyond. So thank you all for coming today. On behalf of the Board of Trustees, I see we have one board member here, Dr. Jack Houlihan, our trustee president. Thank you for joining us. And I thank all of you. And please stay tuned for other forthcoming programs. Thank you.
And thank you.
Thank you for having me.